March 4th, 1973. Two brothers cut through a stand of bare Michigan trees, chasing nothing but boredom. Then they see it, the cranberry red coat everyone in Chesaning knows. The woods go silent, and childhood ends. Dawn Lee Swan Magyar, 20 years old, wife, mother, vanished after a Sunday run to the Owosso Plaza. Her silver Ford Pinto turned up cold behind Montgomery Ward, her keys scattered on the floor, her purchases still bagged. 5 weeks later, in a thicket off an abandoned logging road, Dawn is found. She has fought, she has bled, and she has been executed. 3 shots from a .22, 2 to the head, 1 to the back. The case freezes a small town in place. Friends stop leaving their doors unlocked. Mothers grip children's hands tighter in parking lots. Neighbors look at neighbors and wonder. For years, the file grows heavier, but not clearer, until science catches up with evil. A hair saved in 1973. Fibers. A trace of semen. Evidence that once whispered now speaks in a voice mathematics cannot ignore. Detectives who refuse to quit pair memory with method. A cigarette butt tossed in suburban grass nearly 3 decades later becomes a confession no mouth can retract. A man with a resume of ordinary, pay stub, mailbox, quiet nods meets the one witness he cannot charm. DNA. This is not just a story of murder. It's a story about time, about families who hold vigil, and the mercy of technology that allows the dead to testify. If you follow cold case files, you know what's at stake. Whether truth can outwalk a lifetime of lies, stay with me. In the next 66 minutes, you will step into January and March of 1973, feel the investigation grind, and watch justice wake up. Before we begin, do one thing for Dawn: subscribe, like, and share right now. Please, with someone who believes justice delayed is not justice denied. Ready? Let's open the file. Chesaning, Michigan, January 1973. The snow lies in thin, uneven layers across lawns and frozen fields, like the breath of winter refusing to settle. Streetlights still glow at mid-morning, casting amber halos over the quiet town. The smell of wood smoke drifts from chimneys, and the air hums faintly with the kind of peace people mistake for safety. Inside a small 2-story home on Elm Street, Dawn Lee Swan. Magyar moves through her kitchen with the quick, gentle rhythm of a young mother. 20 years old, barely 5'4", she wears a cranberry red coat draped over a chair and hums as she packs a small list of errands into her purse. Her husband, Dawn Magyar, finishes tying his work boots. On the counter, a coffee pot clicks, percolating its final sigh. Upstairs, their baby boy, Peter, babbles from his crib, half words, half melody. Life here is simple, in the way small-town lives are supposed to be. Dawn works long hours at the plant. Dawn spends her days building warmth inside their new home, cooking, decorating, saving coupons. The neighbors know them by name. Doors stay unlocked. The postman lingers for conversation. It's the kind of world that teaches you to believe in routine. That morning, the thermometer hovers near 25 degrees, and the air bites through the seams of every glove. Dawn borrows a 1970 silver Ford Pinto from her neighbor, Mildred Albright, a modest favor among friends. She plans a quick drive to Owosso, just 20 minutes away, to the Owosso Plaza, a clean, modern mall where you can find everything from curtains to baby clothes. She wants to pick up new towels, maybe a birthday gift for her mother, Eleanor. As she buttons her coat, Peter reaches out from Dawn's arms. Dawn kisses the boy's cheek and promises, "Mommy will be right back." She doesn't know those words will echo for decades. Narrator, third person, reflective. 8. The morning light catches the Pinto's windshield as she pulls out of Elm Street. Her tires hum softly over frost-crusted asphalt, the world unfolding in gray and white tones. There's nothing ominous, no stranger, no warning, just the quiet optimism of a young woman on a Saturday errand. For offenders who hunt opportunity, this kind of routine is gold. The predictable route, the reliable hour, the pattern of safety, these are the details predators memorize. But to Dawn, the repetition is comfort, not risk. In 1973, women move freely in daylight. No one expects danger to bloom in the ordinary. If you grew up in a small town, you know this feeling, the hum of a trusted community, the way everyone waves at the grocery store, the illusion that familiarity equals protection. You never think the place that raised you could also betray you. Back in Chesaning, Don keeps busy fixing a loose cabinet hinge, expecting his wife home before the afternoon football game. Eleanor, Dawn's mother, plans to stop by later with cookies. The day, for them, unfolds in total normalcy because danger, when it comes, rarely announces itself with thunder. At Owosso Plaza, the parking lot gleams with melted snow and reflected sunlight. Dawn finds a spot near J.C. Penney, locks the Pinto, and steps out, her boots leaving crisp impressions in the slush. Inside, the mall hums with the soft chaos of weekend shoppers. Families arguing over shoe sizes, teenagers crowding the record store, the smell of cinnamon pretzels from a nearby kiosk. She shops with purpose, a few kitchen items, a set of towels, a new scarf, but also with the lightness of youth. Clerks remember her smile, her neat handwriting on the check. Around 2:30 p.m. She runs into an old friend, Janice Simpson, near the entrance. They chat briefly, just long enough for Janice to tease her about motherhood's lack of sleep. Everything about this moment radiates normal. There's laughter. There's familiarity. And then Dawn waves goodbye, clutching her bags as she heads toward the parking lot. That goodbye becomes history's last verified image of her alive. Outside, the temperature dips. The sky dims into the muted blue that precedes a Midwest dusk. A dark blue pickup truck idles near the far edge of the lot, its engine a faint growl under the wind. Witnesses later recall a man, receding brown hair, denim jacket, standing near the lane where Dawn's Pinto is parked. But at the time, no one pays attention. Why would they? Men in trucks are as common as snow in Michigan. Dawn never makes it home. As evening falls, Dawn reheats the same pot of coffee. Peter grows restless, sensing absence. Calls go out, to neighbors, to Eleanor, to the police. Within hours, patrol cars trace the roads between Chesaning and Owosso, headlights cutting across frozen cornfields. A missing person alert, handwritten at first, begins to circulate. What happens to the human mind in those first hours? For Dawn, denial collides with dread. For Eleanor, hope stretches into superstition. Maybe she stopped at a friend's house. Maybe the car broke down. In grief psychology, this phase is called cognitive resistance. The refusal to accept a reality still unconfirmed. It's the mind's last defense before collapse. If you're watching this now, imagine waiting in that living room, your baby finally asleep, the phone on the table, every minute stretching longer. Would you call again? Would you drive the route yourself? What would you do when the sheriff's headlights finally appear outside your window? That night, the silence in the Magyar home is unbearable. The clock ticks, the wind presses against the siding, and Dawn stares at the door, expecting a knock that never comes. In the crib, Peter stirs and murmurs his mother's name, his first, unknowing echo of loss. And just like that, A life built on small joys and morning plans fractures. The warmth of Elm Street fades into the cold breath of a Michigan winter, and an ordinary January morning becomes the prologue to one of the state's most haunting cold case files. Chesaning held its breath as the clock slid past 2:30. The afternoon that began with coupons and small comforts drifted toward a colder blue. Dawn stepped from the warmth of Owosso Plaza into a bite of wind. Tightening the cranberry coat, friends recognized instantly. In her hands, 2 modest bags, towels for the house, a scarf for her mother, a few kitchen things that make a rented space feel chosen. Security in 1973 lived more in custom than in cameras. There were no phones to ping a last stop, no lot-wide CCTV, no plate readers. Safety was an understanding. I see you, you see me. On most days, that covenant worked. On this one, it failed. A dark blue pickup idled along the far lane, where salted slush had melted into long, wet seams. The window sat cracked, unspooling a ribbon of smoke. Several witnesses later remembered it as background, more sound than face, a low engine note. Dawn's keys were deep in her coat pocket, habit. The young mother checklist was already in motion. Get home, start dinner, feed Peter, beat the early dusk. She did not clock the man with receding brown hair and a worn denim jacket. Why would she? Men like that cross this lot all the time without becoming important. Outside, the concrete carried prints, boots, flats, tire treads welded into winter noise. Dawn crossed diagonally toward the Pinto, cutting along an aisle speckled with grit. The wind pushed hair across her cheek. Somewhere behind her, a cart rattled. Somewhere ahead, a door slammed. The soundtrack of 100 Saturdays covered what mattered. The pickup rolled forward a few feet and stopped. The driver leaned an elbow on the sill, head canted like a man consulting a map. In predatory psychology, this is called signaling comfort. The offender rehearses belonging, so bystanders look past him. Dawn reached the Pinto, set her bags on the front seat, then tried the ignition out of reflex before remembering keys. She laughed at herself, a small private sound no one would record. She bent, fishing in her pocket. The first approach in an abduction script lasts seconds. Once a stranger enters the hinge space between car and door, options narrow with speed. A question, ma'am, do you know if... A hand on the frame, a weapon out of sight. We do not know the choreography. We know only its consequences. A record store clerk named Phyllis later told police she saw a woman in a red coat speaking briefly with a man and then moving together along a row toward the back of the lot. Not fast, she said, more like following. She could not say whether the woman knew him. She could see the pickup easing into motion again, patience purring. On Elm Street, afternoon gathered without Dawn. Dawn checked the time, then checked again. He lowered the radio because Peter had fallen asleep on his shoulder. He pictured the Pinto pulling in, a gust of cold, Dawn laughing as she shook snow from her coat. He did not picture alternatives. Between 3 and 4, the plaza filled with ordinary traffic. The pickup threaded out. The Pinto remained. The loudspeaker chirped another sail. Time lengthened, as time does when someone should have arrived and hasn't. A janitor, Ronald, would later say he noticed the truck because it was parked odd, away from prime spots, facing out toward a far exit. Parking lots are films with too many extras. Continuity errors are guaranteed. By 5 o'clock, daylight bent toward dusk and the temperature slipped. Don called Mildred to say he hadn't seen the car but expected it any minute. He washed 2 plates instead of 3. He turned the coffee back on. At 6:30, unease broke its silence. Don phoned Eleanor. "She's not home yet," he said, and the room discovered a second gravity. Eleanor's breath fell into the phone in short, disbelieving steps. She told him to try them all. Try friends. Try anyone. He did. Reality refused to answer. At 8, the baby, blissfully ignorant of clocks, cried and would not be soothed. Dawn walked him, patted his back, hummed. The house made new sounds. A spoon on a sink, the hollow pop of a heating duct, the invisible tick of a family story changing tense from present to past. When he finally called the police, his voice seemed to come from far away. The dispatcher logged a missing person, the kind that begins with caution and ends in urgency. 2 cars rolled. Neighbors saw the lights and took up positions at the window. Patrolman Clark opened a notebook and began with the questions that wound even when necessary. When did she leave? What was she wearing? Any fights? Any reason she would choose not to return? Dawn felt the questions as accusations. Eleanor answered where she could, adding textures, Dawn's laugh, her neatness, the way she planned meals. The officers wrote cranberry red coat, dark jeans, worn leather boots. They wrote Owosso Plaza, JCPenney entrance, last seen around 2:30. They did not yet write pickup, because witness statements were hours from coalescing. They wrote disappearance, because the word abduction must be earned. You, watching, might want to shout. Check the lot. Pull the tapes. Talk to the guy in the truck. But this is 1973. There are no tapes. The lot is a sprawl of taillights and unremembered faces. The questions will come. The answers, when they do, will be faint as breath on glass. By 10, officers had driven the route between the plaza and Elm Street twice, scanning ditches, pull-offs, service stations, hospital intake logs. They found nothing, which is to say, they found the possibility of anything still being true. They advised rest and promised more in the morning, advice no one in that house could take. By sunrise, a headline framed the absence. Young mother missing, search widens. Volunteers gathered. K-9 handlers unloaded dogs from trucks, the animals stepping into cold air. Officers unfolded maps on the hood of a cruiser and drew lines with a gloved thumb. Primary routes, secondary roads, the back way out of the lot, locals know. The first fragments arrived from the plaza, a patchwork of clerks and Saturday regulars. Phyllis gave her memory of the conversation by the cars. She could not tell if the man sounded friendly or false. A minute, maybe less, she said. Not arguing. Just talking. 8s. Ronald's note about the truck's placement grew more interesting when paired with a teenager's account from near the arcade. He remembered the pickup creeping a row with the passenger door slightly ajar, as if someone had just stepped out and would be expected back. He remembered the driver's hands at 10:02, precise, as if impatience were being swallowed. Detectives sketched a timeline on a legal pad. It wasn't much. A column of minutes, a line of locations. But meaning settled into the grid. Last sighting at 2:30. Unidentified interaction in the lot. The truck. A window where nothing is witnessed and everything can happen. A likely departure from the far exit that spills onto a less watched road. This is where, if you love cold case files, you lean forward. Not for spectacle, but for pattern. The moment stray threads start to hold. In the psychology of sudden absence, families become archivists. Don gathered details because he could not gather Dawn. He listed what she wore, what she bought, what she planned to cook. Eleanor walked the living room, pausing at familiar objects that refused to answer. A graduation photo, a chipped mug, a list on the fridge in Dawn's neat hand. Radio chatter stitched counties together. Owosso PD, Chisaning officers, Shiawassee deputies. The net widened and, with it, the risk of holes. A detective with a gift for quiet asked Janice to walk him through her chat with Dawn. "Anything unusual?" he asked. "Anything at all?" Janice found only ordinariness. Late afternoon brought a decision. Circulate a description of the truck. Older dark blue Ford pickup. The sheet read, no plates, no sticker, no distinguishing dent. It is both everything and nothing to say older dark blue Ford in Michigan. Officers knew it, but you circulate what you have. Night pressed down again. Volunteers called home with updates. The dog's breath plumed like steam. Somewhere, a truck door closed with a hollow thud that sounded ordinary then and awful now. When absence lasts more than a day, suspicion looks for the nearest hook. Often that hook is the spouse. Dawn understood and braced. He offered his schedule, receipts, the names of anyone who could account for his hours. He surrendered that day to scrutiny because he wanted the rest of the days back. Eleanor went home at midnight and stared at the ceiling like a riddle. She prayed and apologized in the same breath, the way parents do when they cannot protect their children from everything. At the plaza, the night crew hosed the entrance mats and squeegeed the doors. Water whispered across concrete, a sound like a racing. People would hate that detail later, as if cleanliness could wash away clues. In truth, the crucial clues might already have been pocketed by the future. A hair in an envelope, a stain on a swab. They existed, they only needed time. And time, before it becomes the hero of cold case files, is often the villain. The hours after 2:30 stretched like wire, thin, tense, impossible to ignore. The investigation left the warmth of a living room for the arithmetic of ground searches. Patrol cars traced the arteries between Owosso and Chisaning. Deputies slowed for every turnout and ditch glazed with old ice. At a folding table outside the plaza, a paper map grew busy with pencil routes, circles, and question marks. Volunteers arrived in layers. Parkas over sweaters, knit caps tugged low, boots creaking on snow. High schoolers carried flashlights. A pastor handed out coffee. Retirees brought patience you can't teach. The briefing was simple. Call out anything that doesn't belong. A gouge in a snowbank. A scrap of cloth. Prints that begin where they shouldn't or end too soon. K9 handlers snapped orange leads to harnesses. The dogs pulled and breathed fog. Scent lines snagged on crosswinds and frayed near traffic. A lieutenant sent one team to the backlots, liminal spaces where errands collapse into shortcuts. Behind the old Montgomery ward, a band of pines cupped a neglected strip of asphalt. Melted salt left pale veins. Glass pebbles glinted in dirty snow. Neglect is another word for privacy. "Over here!" A volunteer named Doris called, pointing to a silver Ford Pinto parked shy of the trees. No one remembered it arriving. No one claimed it. A deputy keyed his radio. Blue tape and sawhorses sketched a rectangle around the car, the tape twitching in the wind. At a vehicle, context comes first. Is the hood warm? Is the snow melted by heat or sun? Are the tires sunk or crisp? The Pinto was cool. A skin of salt dusted the rear glass. The driver's lock sat down. Inside looked ordinary, the small America of receipts and coins and a forgotten pen. That's the cruelty. Banality says nothing and everything at once. They photographed before they touched, because touch too soon is a kind of forgetting. The camera clicked. Quarter panel, bumper, jam, floor. 2 shopping bags lay on the passenger seat, towels, a kitchen gadget, a scarf Eleanor would have loved. A brown purse rested on the dash. On the driver's mat, a detail that would not behave. Keys scattered, as if gravity had won an argument no one heard. Startled drop. Panicked fumbling. Deliberate removal to erase the possibility of escape. If you've ever lost someone for a handful of hours that felt like a season, you know the double blade of finding their car. Hope flares. She was here. The world remembers her shape. Fear follows. She is not here now. The door opened with the slow respect of surgeons. The cabin smelled of vinyl and winter. No broken glass. No obvious blood. But absence is not innocence. Fibers cling, hairs wander, cells shed as casually as sighs. In 1973, that knowledge owned no miracle. Decades later, it will. And when it does, cold case files will show how whispers became testimony. Under a handheld light, a faint stain bloomed on the passenger mat. Swabbed, labeled, logged. A short, coarse hair hid in the driver's seat crease. Tweezers lifted it into a paper envelope. Photograph. Collect. Seal. Sign. Repeat. To outsiders, the ritual looked fussy. To the people working, it was prayer, a way to fight what time erases. Dawn and Eleanor reached the perimeter. Tape held them back. The car, mute and compact, held back the thing they needed most. Dawn palmed the sawhorse to steady a world unwilling to stay still. Eleanor's breath wrote white pleas in the air. They saw the bags, the purse, the obvious truth that this had been an hour's errand. They did not see Dawn. For one cruel heartbeat, that made hope possible. Night fell like a lid. Reporters arrived with microphones tuned to 2 frequencies at once, public interest and private pain. "What do you want to say to the community?" a young woman asked. Dawn said the only sentence a husband can say without rehearsal. "Please help us find Dawn." Eleanor nodded because speech would have shattered. A tow truck swallowed the Pinto with soft chains and a canvas strap. Metal rose like a question. An officer climbed into the cab because chain of custody is another way to say we will be believed when we tell you what we saw. The car turned a corner, taillights dull as old cherries. In the sheriff's garage, a canvas tarp bay waited. Clipboards gathered signatures. Nothing moved fast. Haste is the enemy of accuracy. A smudged print is how truth becomes rumor. Technicians worked in pairs, narrating each move as if a jury stood in the doorway. Passenger bag removed, logged. Purse opened, photographed. Contents cataloged, coin roll, lipstick, receipt, handwritten note about dinner. 8s. The hair did not match family exemplars. The stain, coaxed by chemicals, browned at the edges, suggestive, not conclusive. The ceiling of 1973 hung low. Blood typing could narrow. Microscopy could hint. Neither could point a courtroom finger. So, the lab did the faithful thing. Write everything down and save it as if the future were already driving toward them. The broader search didn't pause. If anything, the car drew a darker pencil around the map. Teams walked little spurs peeling from commercial roads into 2-lane ribbons heading north and west. They knelt at culverts, peered along ditches where discards pretend to be trash. A deputy measured ruts at a turnout churned to slurry. He jotted a wheelbase figure and, not for the first time, thought about pickups. Inside the briefing room, timelines grew by cautious inches. 2. 30p. M. Last verified sighting near J.C. Penney. Unknown length of contact in the lot. Pinto abandoned behind Montgomery Ward. Arrival time unknown. Male, receding brown hair, denim jacket. Older dark blue pickup, multiple mentions, no plate. Boxes stayed unknown unless something heavier than hope could fill them. The psychology corner kept its square of table. Parking lot abductions favor speed and surprise. The ambush zone is a hinge between stepping in and pulling the door. Rehearsed offenders choose peripheral rows where a voice can vanish into ordinary noise. Control wears courtesy. Do you know if... Can you help me? The weapon waits off stage until the script leaves no room for escape. On Elm Street, Peter woke in the blue hour and called for his mother with a word so round it broke Eleanor twice. Dawn paced a groove into the carpet. The phone rang and rang. Tips. Prayers. Strangers convinced that a thing they saw once might matter now. By morning, the Pinto looked more like a diagram than a car, surfaces dusted, edges taped, cavities exposed to the camera's steady eye. Envelopes were sealed and initialed. Boxes were labeled with a date and a name. Not an ending, just a promise. When better tools exist, this will still be waiting. If you follow cases like this, you know the paradox that arrives now. The car is a breakthrough that doesn't break through. It draws a circle and writes, "Here." It cannot yet write, "Who?" And yet, in the architecture of proof, it matters. A hair becomes a sentence. A swab becomes testimony. Time, which devours, sometimes delivers. By dusk, the backlot returned to its green hush. The tape came down. Pine needles moved in wind that no longer smelled like floodlights and fear. People drove past on errands, shivering at a story without a name. Across town, on a metal shelf, a cardboard box settled and waited. The search widened. The calendar advanced. And somewhere, a dark blue pickup merged back into the background it had always pretended to be. The woods did not give up their secret easily. March light filtered through bare branches while wind combed the bramble along an abandoned logging path outside Chapin. Two brothers, Wayne and Bill Summers, were playing at exploration. First came the smell, sweet and wrong, then the color. Cranberry wool against gray earth. Deputies sealed the perimeter. Blue tape fluttered from saplings. A narrow lane became a corridor between worlds, one where people hoped and another where evidence spoke. A state detective crouched and looked. The body lay partially concealed by thorn and winterfall, clothing disordered by violence and weather. The red coat still clung to one shoulder. Worn leather boots marked the last steps Dawn would take. Her wedding ring remained, a small circle that refused to close the larger one. Before a hand touched anything, a camera touched everything. Wide shots fixed the scene, mid-shots anchored relationships, tight frames cached details that eyes forget when hearts want answers. Placards marked the foot, the coat hem, a shallow scuff where a knee might have struck. You want to believe there is a footprint shaped like guilt. Mostly there is only chaos shaped by weather. Frozen ground held impressions poorly. Thaw smeared what might have been clearer a day sooner. Concealment was minimal. Brush pulled over, not burial. That choice means confidence. Distance and time will finish what shrubs begin. Paramedics stood back. The coroner's team advanced with measured authority. A thermometer skimmed the liver. Lividity and rigor were read like clocks. Death was not yesterday. It had been weeks. Predation, assault, execution, return. The path through those verbs is the story this place refuses to say aloud. At the autopsy, the story spoke in metal and tissue. 3 .22 caliber wounds. 1 to the back, 2 to the head. The back shot read like compliance enforcement. The headshots read like certainty. Close range. Stippling suggested intimacy of inches. Abrasions tracked the forearms and knees, defensive and positional. In 1973, the laboratory's reach was shorter, but its discipline was long. Clothing dried in separate bags. Combing trays collected hair and debris. Swabs preserved biological traces that could not yet be named. Fibers were taped, soil vouchered. Bullets were recovered and measured. Nothing miraculous, everything methodical. The site, read as a book, had a table of contents. Approach from the 2-track. Primary scene by the snag of Hawthorne. Drag marks shallow, more guided steps than towing. A depression where weight settled, consistent with kneeling or resisting. Brush tugged over after. The offender trusted removal in obscurity more than camouflage. Psychology colored the margins. Body left partially dressed, ring untouched. This offender's currency was not theft, but control. Secondary disposal close to vehicle access. He reduces exposure time, exits along a known lane. Confidence mixed with caution. He doesn't need artistry, he needs minutes. If you are the mother, you are beyond analysis. You would fold the coat to your chest and carry it home. If you are the detective, you force the world into columns so it cannot drown you. If you are the viewer, you may hold both, the ache and the architecture, because that's how cold case files keep stories whole. A grid search radiated from the point of discovery. Flagging tape bloomed like flowers. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder, eyes down. A hair gleamed on a twig, collected. A cigarette filter half buried in duff, bagged, because habit once discarded can become identity decades later. A spent .22 casing, none visible. Cartography added weight to hunches. Pin the plaza. Pin the back lot by Montgomery Ward. Pin the logging path. Draw lines that favor privacy and speed. The map began to favor a vehicle with clearance and a driver who knows where pavement quits. The dark blue pickup fit the terrain like a key in a worn lock. Back at the morgue, the language grew quieter. A pathologist documented sexual assault. Nails were scraped, each hand a tiny archive. Bullets went to ballistics. Second person, briefly. Imagine the moment the family is told. Words are careful. The room is colder than outside. A blankness wraps the first seconds, then heat behind the eyes that will return for years. Someone asks for a detail that can be held without breaking. The ring, perhaps. Scene reading returned to the question. How did the offender feel here? Calm enough to linger? Hurried enough to miss? Minimal concealment and chosen access argue a practice script. He knows where a truck can nose in without notice. He understands a winter afternoon invites fewer intrusions. Still, the scene left him vulnerable to the ordinary. A neighbor who remembers a plate fragment, a mechanic who recalls a dent, a cigarette forgotten in brush. Predators hide in routine. They also shed it. By nightfall, the lane returned to wind and owls. Markers stayed, guarded. Deputies drove the 2-track twice more, each pass slower. The report closed with sentences that felt like doors. Identity confirmed, evidence collected, homicide, gunshot wounds, sexual assault. Unknown suspect. Unknown for now. Because evidence bagged when it could not yet speak is still evidence. Because a hair on a seat crease, a stain on a mat, a trace collected from clothing can outlast alibis. Years later, those whispers will sing in alleles and odds. A discarded cigarette will cross a gap nothing else could bridge. For the moment, the scene kept its vow. To hold, not to solve. The living carried the harder part. Grief without resolution, caution turned habit, a town's unlocked doors finding their locks. And the box on the shelf grew heavier because it now contained not just absence but a place, a map, truths. Justice was not here yet. But it had been invited. It knew the route. Victimology begins with the life Dawn actually lived. 20 years old, newly married, mother of a 1-year-old, she moved inside a low-risk routine. Daytime shopping, familiar routes, short stops. Her choices were not reckless. They were ordinary. In criminology terms, she was a suitable target only because an offender engineered the one ingredient she could not control, proximity on his terms. Routine activity theory frames it simply. A motivated offender, a suitable target, and the absence of capable guardianship. Owosso Plaza on a winter Saturday supplied all three. The offender's motivation pre-existed her arrival. Dawn's predictability made timing easy. Guardianship failed in the gap between open doors and private space, that hinge of seconds where a kind question can mask coercion. The parking lot is an offender's classroom. Lighting is uneven, sightlines break around parked trucks, and noise is camouflage. When Dawn reached her Pinto and bent for her keys, her attention narrowed. Predators study that narrowing. The man with receding brown hair and a worn denim jacket did not need to be theatrical. He needed to be first to the hinge. What does the crime say about him? Partial undress and sexual assault reveal a control-oriented offender. 3. 22 caliber shots, 2 to the head, 1 to the back, signal instrumental violence. Efficient, rehearsed, meant to finish. The 22, common and concealable, suggests practicality over bravado. He valued speed and certainty over spectacle. Disposal choices teach more. He transported Dawn to a secondary site along a logging spur near Chapin, close to a 2-track, away from houses, shielded by brush. Minimal concealment, not burial, implies confidence in time and terrain. He counted on distance and winter to slow discovery. That is the signature of someone comfortable on back roads, someone who knows shortcuts. Then there is the truck. Witnesses noted an older dark blue pickup idling at the lot's edge. Offenders who operate alone and move victims quickly prefer vehicles with elevation and unlocked passenger doors. A truck is also a social costume in mid-Michigan. No one stares at a pickup in winter. Age and demeanor? Likely mid-30s to early 40s. Physically unremarkable, practiced at small talk, and detached enough to improvise. Predators of this type present as helpful or capable, the kind of man a clerk recalls only as a jacket and a haircut. He rehearses proximity, not conversation. Pre-crime behavior likely included cruising and scanning. 2 or 3 loops of the lot, attention fixed on women exiting alone. He might test doors, ask benign questions, offer to help load purchases. The goal is tempo, managing seconds so the victim has none to spare. When Dawn looked down for her keys, the script advanced. Post-crime behavior shifts to containment. He drives roads he knows and selects a spur he's confident is underused. He remains long enough to assert control, then stages minimal concealment and departs. Back at home, offenders like this over-normalize, clocking in on Monday, mowing the yard, waving at neighbors, watching the news about the search with affect that reads as tired, not terrified. 8's forensic awareness, moderate. He left the ring, robbery was irrelevant. He risked trace transfer in the vehicle and at the scene. In 1973, the risk felt low. He could not imagine DNA turning whispers into verdicts. Time was his alibi, until time learned to speak. Geography matters. Offenders maintain comfort zones, inner areas to approach, middle zones to deposit, outer zones to avoid. Owosso to Chapin fits a middle zone offender. Close enough to navigate, far enough to add delay. He may live southeast, work north or west, and shop the same plaza without scrutiny. Personality threads appear between the lines. Entitlement disguised as competence, a grievance against women who appear free, a need to control outcomes down to the placement of a body. He is not flamboyant. He does not relish conversations about the case. He swallows them, answers briefly, and shifts topics. You, listening, might ask how not to live afraid. The answer is not fear, it is attention. Keep keys in hand. Park under lights. If a stranger collapses the space between you and your car, step back, re-enter the store, ask for an escort. Guardianship can be made, moment by moment. This is where Cold Case Files derives its gravity. Victimology honors the person. Profiling limits the hunt. Opportunity analysis teaches prevention. None of it blames. All of it resists erasure. Finally, the offender's most durable mask is plainness. He will pass as a coworker, a neighbor, a man who never raises his voice. He may even coach safety to others, in plain sight. What unmasks him, in the end, is not bravado, but residue, the microscopic breadcrumb trail every human leaves. The scene stored that residue. The Pinto stored it. Dawn's clothing stored it. And decades later, when science collected its breath, those fragments aligned like stars and spelled a name. Grief does not keep the calendar the police keep. It ignores lines, shows up at breakfast or while folding a dish towel, and lingers after the search parties go home. In Chesaning, winter settled in quietly. The box on the evidence shelf was labeled and lifted, but inside the Magyar home, the case was not a folder. It was the air. Dawn learned the work of waiting. He returned to his shift, clocked in, clocked out, came back to a house that held a silence you could hear. He fixed things that did not need fixing, cabinet hinges, a stubborn window sash, because tightening a screw felt like winning against chaos. He kept Peter on a routine. Warm milk, soft songs, short walks on safe sidewalks. Eleanor created a ritual for the photos. She dusted frames, lined them along the mantel, and spoke aloud to her daughter as if the right words could carry across. The scarf Dawn never got to give became a relic, folded into a drawer that smelled of cedar. Some nights, Eleanor sat with a rosary and counted back through the days. Where Dawn stood, what she held, the ordinary last things. Neighbors tried. They brought casseroles and offers to babysit and the awkward comfort of presence. For a week, the doorbell rang steadily. Then life's centrifugal force returned everyone to their urgencies. The casseroles stopped, but the looks in the grocery store continued, soft, sorry, and scared. The town changed its posture. Porch lights that used to go dark by 10 stayed on past midnight. Women parked closer to storefronts. Husbands reminded wives to call from the road. The sound of a truck idling in a lot no longer meant nothing. People looked up and learned the cadence of caution without wanting the lesson. At church, Father O'Connell prayed for the family and the unnamed soul responsible. He said justice was patient, which felt like comfort and punishment at once. After Mass, older women clasped Eleanor's hands and said they remembered when Dawn wore white gloves on Easter. Memory became a chorus and a sentence. The media's attention came in waves. Dawn stepped into the light when he had to, saying the same words. She is loved. She is missed. We need help. Each appearance cost him, but he paid because forgetting was the enemy. Later, he watched the segment and wondered how a life could be compressed into 2 minutes. You understand this if you've watched cases fade from front pages. Outrage burns hot, then dims. Routine reasserts itself. For survivors, time is not forward motion. It is a spiral, returning them to anniversaries and almosts. January 27th. March 4th. Dates that turn the body into a barometer. On those dates, the vigils grew. Candles outside St. Christopher's. A cluster of neighbors, then dozens. Children in mittens, the elderly with blankets. Dawn spoke briefly. Eleanor sometimes could, sometimes couldn't. Peter, growing, held a candle taller each year and watched faces that said his mother's name with gentleness. The investigators did not quit. They re-interviewed witnesses, measured distances, and sent memos that began Magyar case, follow up. A new detective rotated in and learned the geography of grief. Plaza, back lot, logging path. He drove it with the radio low. Rumor took the long way around. Some said drifters, some said someone local, some said both. Rumor offers control when fact withholds it. See, it also wounds. Dawn learned to ignore the speculative and answer only to what could be named. He kept a folder of clippings anyway, because archive is another word for hope. Peter grew into a careful child. He liked puzzles and drawing. He learned to read the weather of rooms. At school, he heard careless sentences and went quiet. A teacher noticed and chose to be a steady adult. Trauma isn't only crisis, it is accumulation. The micro decisions that teach a child whether the world can be predicted. Community life continued with a tilt. The carnival set up in summer, and laughter sounded thinner. Halloween came with brighter flashlights and more pairs walking together. The old men at the diner argued football and taxes and, sometimes, danger, and the talks had a new gravity. Eleanor's faith shifted but did not shatter. She made space for candles that burned on ordinary nights, small circles of discipline against the dark. Dawn learned the scripture of maintenance. Change the oil, pay the bill, keep the heat at 68, make a list, call the detective, write the date. When gratitude arrived for a decent shift, for Peter's laugh, it surprised him. He let it. Second person, briefly, if you have loved someone who was taken, you know the arithmetic of the long winter. Progress equals any day you can picture their face without the room spinning. Setbacks equal a song on the radio or the taste of coffee from a place you shop together. You get better at carrying the weight. It does not get lighter. The case aged, but it did not die. The evidence did what evidence does best when people care for it. It waited. Sealed envelopes slept on metal shelves. Reports were retyped as they browned. Every few months a lab request went out and came back a polite negative. Each no was a kind of yes. We are still trying. And the town learned how to be two things at once. Fearful and kind, wary and watchful. It learned that security is not the absence of threat, but the presence of each other. It learned how to say Dawn's name with remembrance, not rumor. When the wind came off the fields and the streetlights hummed, people kept looking up. Justice had not arrived, but attentiveness had, and it stayed. The case did not sleep. It held its breath. On a steel shelf beneath steady fluorescent hum, the Magyar box waited through retirements, reorganizations, and budgets that treated hope like a luxury. Inside, the future was already coiled. A coarse hair in a paper envelope, a swab dried and sealed from the Pinto's mat, clothing packaged in layers like a winter within a winter, bullets nestled in cotton beside a careful date. Good evidence is a letter to tomorrow. We could not read this then, so we saved it. In the early 1990s, Science began to answer that letter. Polymerase chain reaction, PCR, taught small laboratories to copy genetic whispers until they became sentences. Technicians who once lived by fiber charts and comparison microscopes learned a new choreography. Pipettes, centrifuges, thermal cyclers, stepping temperature up and down like miniature seasons. Peaks rose on capillary graphs the way faces rise from memory, incrementally, then all at once. A detective carried the cardboard reliquary to the state lab and signed for it like a vow. Intake logged every seal and signature with the reverence people reserve for relics. The old brown tape remained. New tamper strips crossed it in neat red lines. Garments were unfurled with the patience a nurse uses with bandages, air-dried again, then sampled from protected zones. The mat swab was split so the original could remain whole. The unknown hair was divided for microscopy and mitochondrial work. Results did not crash like thunder. They arrived as weather. Controls ran first, the negative like a lullaby, the positive like a tuning fork. Contamination was the ghost at every banquet, so analysts set more plates than guests and blessed each with barcodes and initials. Locus by locus, the profile took on shape, numbers at markers that mean nothing alone, then everything in chorus. The lab spoke quietly, because certainty prefers modest rooms. The first victories wore the clothes of disappointment. Exclusions. The neighbor people always suspected for no good reason. The hothead from a town over, the man with a similar truck, the profile cleared them. Subtraction is a compass. Every not him points the needle. Detectives who had nursed grudges against names they disliked let go and wrote cleaner lists. Truth is not a friend to bias. It is a friend to procedure. You, watching, may ask why years pass between promise and answer. Because backlogs grew like drifts, because benches were few, because the ethic that saved the evidence demanded patience to interpret it. Cold Case Files is built on that ethic, preserved now. So, when science arrives, truth still has a body to inhabit. The same care that tweezed a hair in 1973 now guarded it with gloves and paperwork in 1997. Continuity is not glamorous, but it wins. Detectives reread the file as if the margins had sprouted new ink. They put behavior beside biology and asked focused questions. Who combines control with speed? Who knows the back ways between Owosso and Chapin? Who was verifiably in mid-Michigan after January 27, 1973, and carried a record that rhymed with this cruelty? Names resurfaced like stones when the river drops. One file, heavier than its paper, rose to the top. A man ordinary in public, practiced in private harm. The strategy they wrote on a whiteboard was simple because simplicity survives court. Watch, wait, and collect what he throws away. In modern forensics, trash is autobiography without an audience. Cups, straws, tissues, a cigarette crushed into the seam where grass meets curb, each carries the cellular shorthand of a life. Surveillance settled into a patient rhythm. Unmarked cars learned the block like a heartbeat. Detectives rotated thermoses in silence. It came on a pewter morning. He fetched mail in a quiet subdivision, leaned against the post, and smoked. When the butt arced into low brush, the moment looked like nothing, half a second of habit. 30 heartbeats later, a plainclothes officer on a walk stooped, slipped the filter into a sterile tube, and kept moving. Chain of custody would soon graft that street corner to a winter afternoon in 1973 with a single, unbroken line of ink. In the lab, the tube was just another number, which is how justice avoids bias. It went through the same controls, the same temperature cycles, the same careful tabulations. Then the alleles sang. Peaks rose at the same coordinates as the profile coaxed years earlier from Dawn's clothing and the Pinto's mat. Analysts do not celebrate with fireworks. They answer with certainty. They repeated the run, blinded the sample, switched machines, and repeated again. Nothing changed but the volume of the truth. The call to the squad room landed like a bell at noon. A detective who had carried the case through its longest winter placed his palm on the box without thinking, the way you steady something that has finally moved. Warrants drafted over coffee became warrants signed before the ink cooled. The arrest plan favored quiet competence over spectacle, redundancies stacked like ribs, routes mapped for what-ifs, medics staged, a public information officer ready to say the truth and no more. Second person, briefly, imagine the threshold at dawn. You have knocked on doors for families begging the universe for a sound. You have promised a grandmother and a son that the day would come when care would turn into consequence. When the ram lands and the lock gives, when the man you have studied blinks into the bladed light of a hallway full of law, you feel three strands braided: relief, anger, and a sober peace that does not gloat. The public paragraph would be crisp. DNA linked the suspect to the 1973 homicide. He was taken into custody without incident. But the real narrative pulsed beneath. A hair saved in paper, a swab dried before anyone could dream of PCR, cloth folded and boxed by people who believed in tools they might never live to use. Every signature on a seal had been a bridge plank. The discarded cigarette did not create the evidence. It completed the circuit. Press microphones surfaced like cattails after rain. The prosecutor stood with detectives and an analyst and translated the graphs into English. He did not promise perfection. He described specificity, independent samples converging on the same individual with power that survives cross-examination. A reporter asked about motive. The detective said motive is a story. The law needs a hand. Another asked what took so long. The analyst said the truth had to be measured, not merely sensed. For Dawn and Eleanor and Peter, the phone call was weather-breaking after years of gray, a rush of air you did not know you were missing until it returned. Relief, then grief renewed, then gratitude that a courtroom would carry Dawn's name farther than a living room ever could. Candlelight had preserved memory. Science had turned memory into momentum. And the town finally exhaled, together. The warrant waited like a held breath, but before ink could turn into handcuffs, the squad had to win the quiet game. Surveillance began without theater. No sirens, no swagger, just unmarked sedans that learned the neighborhood better than the mailman. They mapped his routine like a river, bends, returns, tides. Mondays meant an early commute. Thursdays, groceries after 5, Saturdays, a garage door yawning open, then closed. He waved, he shoveled, he blended. Predators often do. A logbook fattened with inches rather than leaps. Time of exit, direction of travel, companions, whether a cap shadowed his face, whether a jacket was zipped. The goal wasn't hunch, it was court. They wanted something he would throw away without thinking, something that could travel from curb to chain of custody without a single imaginative step. Cups failed them. He rinsed. Straws failed them. He crumpled. The mailbox offered circulars, but no fingerprints they could bank on. Patience widened its shoulders. In briefings, someone always said, "Let the opportunity come to us." And somebody else always nodded because patience had brought them this far. It came in pewter weather. He shuffled out in slippers, pried open the mailbox, and sighed through the junk mail. With his free hand, he lit a cigarette. Smoke ribboned into the cold. 2/3 down, he pinched the coal and dropped the filter where grass frayed into curb. Litter to a neighbor. A signature to the state. The choreography took a heartbeat. A plainclothes detective rounded the corner, slowed to tie a shoe, and knelt exactly where the filter slept. Nitrile gloves, tweezers, sterile tube, cap, lift, seat, seal. He kept walking. Chain of custody began as ink on plastic. A second detective witnessed and initialed. Back at the lab, the label's number mattered more than the suspect's name. Blinding protects truth from eagerness. The sample entered a small republic of controls. Temperatures cycled like seasons. Capillaries spoke in fluorescent syllables. Peaks arrived at the same coordinates that had waited since 1973 in Dawn's clothing and on the Pinto's mat. Analysts reran, reblinded, recalibrated. The same story told itself. The call to the squad room sounded ordinary, just a phone ringing until the words gave it a spine. A detective who had carried the file for years set his palm on the cardboard lid and finally exhaled a breath that had been living inside his chest since the first vigil. The arrest plan read like architecture rather than adventure. Outer cars to lock the block, inner team to breach and clear, medic staged, a public information officer ready with one honest paragraph. No theater. Theater leaks doubt. Dawn came low and gray. Unmarked cars drifted into position as if the street preferred to be quiet. On a whispered count, the breachers took the porch. One on the battering ram, one on hinge, one on eyes. Police. Search warrant. Wood yielded with a flat, serious sound. The line flowed. Inside, the living room smelled of old fabric and last night's dinner. He stumbled from the hallway in sweats, hands rising, mouth forming denials older than the furniture. A detective with a calm voice turned him, cuffed him, and spoke the sentence the room had owed for decades. You are under arrest for the murder of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. Naming Dawn made the air different. Curtains lifted all along the street. A man froze on his porch with a bag of rock salt in hand. An older neighbor pressed fingers to her throat. I waved to him yesterday, she whispered, and the ordinary cracked along the grain. In the cruiser, he stared at his knees. Detectives watched for small tells, flinches at names, blinks at places, not because they needed confession, but because truth likes company. At headquarters, booking was ritual and relief. Photographs, fingerprints, the exchange of clothes for county cloth, a property slip that itemized a life with the indifference of inventory. In the interview room, he offered the scriptmen offer when history corners them. You've got the wrong guy. I never knew her. DNA gets mixed up. The detective across the table let the clock do its work. Sometimes silence is cross-examination. When he finally said, I want a lawyer, the detective nodded. Rights honored are pillars that hold verdicts up. News traveled first as a rumor, then as text that crawled beneath lunchtime weather. The prosecutor faced microphones and kept to the narrow road. DNA evidence links the suspect to the 1973 homicide. He was arrested without incident. The investigation continues. Reporters ask the questions they keep in their pockets. Motive, timeline, how sure. The analyst translated statistics into gravity. Independent samples, matching profiles, power measured in orders of certainty. For Dawn and Eleanor and Peter, the phone rang in the ordinary rhythm of a weekday and changed the temperature of the room. Relief braided to grief. Justice proves. It does not return. Dawn thanked the detective and sat, crying without apology. Eleanor steadied herself against the counter, then touched the frame she dusted every Sunday. Peter, grown now, closed his eyes and said his mother's name the way someone says a prayer that has finally found an answer. Outside, the street became a street again. The ram print in the jam would be patched, The neighbor with the rock salt scattered his crystals and went back inside. Dogs resumed their negotiations with squirrels. The squad left not to celebrate, but to paperwork. The last guardrail against forgetting. In the evidence room, a box that had learned to wait finally learned to breathe. Across a town that had kept vigil through many winters, porch lights that once stayed on for safety clicked off because the night felt safer again. The interview room was built to ignore drama. Cinder block walls, a metal table, 2 chairs that did not invite comfort. He sat cuffed at the wrists, eyes rimmed with sleep and anger. Across from him, the detective who had carried Dawn's case through the long winter placed a thin stack of photographs on the table and folded his hands. No shouting. No theatrics. Just gravity. "State your name for the record," the detective said. Then, a timeline. Owosso Plaza. The back lot by Montgomery Ward. The logging spur near Chapin. Each location was a key turned in a lock. The man kept repeating variations of innocence. "I don't know her." "You're wrong. DNA isn't perfect." The detective nodded, unfazed, and slid forward the lab report distilled for court. Profiles generated from clothing and the Pinto's mat, a profile from a discarded cigarette, independent matches, rerun, rechecked. Silence arrived and sat between them. If you've watched cold case files, you know this part. When the numbers speak, denial shrinks, but pride won't let it die. The detective asked nothing for a full minute, letting the clock carry the weight. Finally, the man said, flat, "Lawyer." The detective ended the questioning, thanked him, and stood. Rights honored, chain preserved. Booking finished the choreography of consequence. Property logged, fingerprints inked, a cell door that closed with an iron certainty. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's team convened under fluorescent quiet to draft charges. Some counts were time-barred by the era's law. Murder was not. First-degree homicide, premeditation inferred from control, abduction, transport, and execution shots would be the spine of the case. At the podium, the prosecutor spoke carefully. "Today we filed a charge of first-degree murder in the killing of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar. DNA evidence links the defendant to the crime." Reporters asked about motive. "Courtroom's judge acts," he said. Asked about the odds, the analyst translated statistics into plain English. Profiles from separate items converging on the same person, confirmed across repeated runs and controls. The call reached Dawn and Eleanor and Peter like weather changing. Relief, grief, and steadiness arrived together. Dawn whispered, "Thank you." Eleanor set a candle on the sill. Peter stood taller, the way a son does when the past finally points to a door that opens. In the file room, someone slid a new tab into the binder. Charged. The box did not get lighter, but it felt different, no longer only a record of harm, but a ledger in motion. Justice had taken a pen. Across town, porch lights that had burned like centuries dimmed a notch. The community did not celebrate. It breathed, slow, grateful, waiting for arraignment, for a courtroom, for the verdict truth deserved. Courtrooms are designed for daylight. Fluorescents erase mood. Clocks insist on order. Yet when the case of Dawn Lee Swan Magyar was called, the room felt like weather, electric, heavy, inevitable. 12 jurors filed in with the expression citizens borrow when history taps them. On one side, the family who had learned to breathe between anniversaries. On the other, a man who had passed for ordinary so long that ordinary had become his disguise. Opening statements set the map. The prosecutor traced January 27th, 1973, like coordinates. Owosso Plaza, the Pinto behind Montgomery Ward, the logging path near Chapin. This is a story about proximity, control, and science, he said, about evidence preserved and proved by method. The defense answered with doubt. No witness saw the act, counsel said. Old evidence can be misread. Memory can be mistaken. Two stories took their seats. Only one would survive contact with procedure. The state began with the ground. Witnesses from the plaza described the red coat, the brief conversation, the older dark blue pickup idling as if it belonged to the scenery. Detectives walked jurors through the Pinto. Purchases left, keys scattered, photographs that turned ordinary into exhibit. The pathologist's voice never rose as she described the 22 caliber wounds, 1 to the back, 2 to the head, and signs of sexual assault. Precision, not theater, carried the weight. Then came the laboratory, the bridge from 1973 to the present. Analysts explained controls, loci, and profiles in human terms, numbers that align like fingerprints written in code. They showed how the unknown profile lifted from clothing, and the car's mat matched the profile from a discarded cigarette, independent samples converging with power measured in staggering odds. The defense cross-examined every seal and signature, looking for a frayed thread. The thread held. If you follow cold case files, you know the rhythm. Exclusions until one identity remains, not by guess, but by elimination and match. Jurors watched peaks rise on projected graphs and, more importantly, watched professionals refuse drama. Restraint reads as credibility when facts are strong. The defense called no parade. It pressed reasonable doubt, suggested contamination, questioned recollection, whispered that decades fog detail. But it could not move the math or the map. In closing, the prosecutor returned to first principles. A victim with a low-risk routine, an offender who engineered proximity, a car that became a silent witness, a scene that told the truth, and a technology that let that truth speak. Time is not mercy, he said. It is storage. 8. Impact statements were brief and devastating. Peter stood with a photograph of his mother and spoke without ornament. He talked about birthdays he could not remember and lessons learned from a person he knew through stories. He thanked the jurors for listening to a voice forced to wait. Eleanor held Dawn's hand, shoulders trembling, the way people tremble when relief has somewhere to land. Deliberations lasted long hours that felt like a rainstorm you can smell but cannot see. The family sat in the hallway with paper cups of water and a quiet that had taken years to practice. When the bailiff opened the door at last, every breath paused. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson read, we find the defendant guilty. 8. Sound rushed back, cries, a gasp, the scrape of a chair. The judge thanked the jurors for their precision and sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment without parole. No speeches. Just the sentence the evidence had truly earned. Outside, cameras waited, but the family chose a different light, daylight. They said Dawn's name and went home to a table where candles could be lit for gratitude and grief. In the evidence room, a clerk slid a final tab into the binder. Verdict. The box on the shelf did not disappear, but it stopped being a container of harm. It became a record of a promise kept. The verdict did not rewind the years. It rethreaded them. In Chesaning, porch lights finally clicked off at a decent hour, not because the town forgot, but because vigilance could share space with sleep. Dawn brewed coffee the next morning, and it tasted like something other than waiting. Eleanor set a candle on the windowsill without pleading this time. It burned like thanks. Peter, older now, held his mother's photograph and understood that memory can be both anchor and sail. justice did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as process fulfilled. A hair rescued from 1973, a swab that outlived doubt, a cigarette butt that turned habit into testimony. Cold Case Files has always preached this sermon softly. Save what you can. Label it well. Trust the day you cannot see. The people who boxed evidence decades ago were writing a letter to the future. Science finally opened it, pronounced the name inside, and returned the letter to the family it was meant for. Communities learn from such letters. They learn that safety is not a guarantee, but a practice, that routine needs companions, light, company, attention. They learn to care for the people who keep caring. The detective who keeps a photograph in his desk, the analyst who reruns controls because restraint convinces where rhetoric cannot. You, watching, carry a piece of that practice forward every time you walk someone to their car, call in a tip, or ask for an escort rather than gamble on a dark aisle. There is a larger meaning, too. Cases like Dawn's remind us that cold does not mean forgotten. It means preserved. It means a pause between the cruelty and the consequence, a pause you can shorten with resources and will. When you support Cold Case Files, you are voting for that will. Better lab benches, smarter databases, wider nets that still honor rights. You are investing in the unglamorous virtues, chain of custody, meticulous notes, envelopes that open only when they should. In Chapin's woods, the wind still moves the thorn and hawthorn. The lane is just a lane again. Yet the ground holds a different story now, one where truth kept walking until it caught up. Dawn's name belongs to this ending. Not vanished, not rumor, not a question on a bulletin board. A sentence with a period. If this story stayed with you, let it move you. Subscribe, share, and tell someone why the long work matters. Justice woke here. Help it wake again. For the next family still waiting, be the light. Stay attentive, support testing, push for resources, and keep names alive. Together, we turn cold rooms into courtrooms everywhere.